Okay. Hello, this is the presentation for the database project. So we are from the team F, which consists of Taiwan Jun, Ricky, and myself, Amjad. Okay, so first let's go to the mission objective of this project. So the objective of the project is to create a system that can centralize the rubric into an efficient rubric bank. Second, to help students view the continuous assessment grade and progress. Third, to help the lecturer prepare students' grade report for the course owner and program coordinator. And lastly, to get better understanding on the concept of database system. Okay, we moving on. So this is the workflow that we come up with after the interview with the stockholder. Okay, so first in our workflow is to define the system to be by studying the SE system, and then we create the DFD of that system to be. Next, we create the conceptual ERD and also the logical ERD. After that, we normalize the logical ERD uh, and create the SQL using Oracle. And lastly, we apply that into the user interface. Okay, now let's get to the DFD. Uh, okay, so this is the system to be. We have five entity or the stockholder here. Okay, first is the program coordinator here. So the program coordinator received the PLO achievement report and give out the program learning outcome or PLO. Okay, second is the course owner. Course owner received the CLO achievement report and give out course learning outcome. Okay, for the course coordinator, it received the PLO and CLO and it come out with the rubric marking template. As for the lecturer, it received rubric marking schema, student assignment, and it give out the grading information, assignment rubric requirement, and student grade. And lastly, for the last entity, which is student, the student submit the assignment and receive the graded assignment, and also receive the assignment with rubric schema. Okay, now let's go to the conceptual ERD. So as the conceptual ERD, we expand more from that first DFD. Okay, it still have the original five uh, entity, which is course owner. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So it's still have the course owner, the program coordinator here, student, uh, the lecturer. Okay, and the course coordinator. Okay. So in this conceptual ERD, we have here the course learning outcome. We have course program learning outcome, and we have rubric entity. We have student assignment request that student can request into the entity assignment, uh, and we also have the student assignment that the students submit to the lecturer. Okay, and then we have a student result which give from the lecturer to the student. Okay, now let's move on to the logical ERD. So in the logical ERD, we have added a few more entity which help to understand more about the system. Okay, so the entity that I added are course coordinator CLO reference, which connect to the course coordinator. Same goes for the PLO, which we have course coordinator PLO reference. And then we have a lecturer rubric reference, which connect between the rubric and the lecturer. Uh, and we have assignment rubric reference which connect assignment to the rubric, and we also have the student rubric reference to connect the student and the rubric. Okay, now let's move on to the normalized logical ERD. So in this normalized logical ERD, we after we completed the normalization process, we have added a new entity here, which is a program cost. And for other entity, we have reduced it attribute. For example, here student result now contain four attribute. So this is the unnormalized, which is a lot of attribute here. And after we complete the normalization, it reduce here. Same goes for the course learning outcome. Okay, so that's all for my part. I'm giving it to Taiwan Jun.
I'm Taiwan Jun. I'm going to present about the data definition and data manipulation that we did for these projects. So in the indicator we use, which is a red rectangle for our primary key for the entity, and then a yellow rectangle for the foreign key for the entity, and pink rectangle for the foreign key and the primary key for the attribute of the entity. So in this project, we have added the 22 entities, which is based on the normalized ERD that I'm just explained. So if we're moving toward the first entity, which is the course owner, as you can see, we have entered 10 values, 10 data in the data manipulation for the course owner. And as you can see from here, the course owner ID is not now, which is the primary key of this entity, and we have the course owner password and course owner email. Both is also a not now value. So moving to the second entity, which is a program coordinator. So same with the course owner. The program coordinator ID is a primary key for this entity, and we have a program coordinator password, email as a not now attribute for this entity. So same case, we enter 10 values, 10 data for this entity, as you can see in this example. So moving to the next entity, which is course coordinator. The course coordinator ID is same, which is a primary key, and we have a course coordinator password and email, which is a not now value, and with the 10 data for it. Moving to next, which is course, which is a little bit different. We have a course ID, which is a primary key for this attribute, and we have a course owner ID, which refer to the course owner ID, and we have a course coordinator ID, which refer to the course coordinator of course coordinator ID, and we have entered the data for this attribute too. So moving next to the fifth entity, which is a course learning outcome. We have the first attribute, which is CRO ID, which is a primary key for this entity, and we have a CRO content, which we store it as varchar 255, so we can store the content into it, and we have the course ID, which refer to the course of the course ID. So moving to the sixth attribute, which is a course ID, which is a program course entity. The first attribute is course ID, which refer to the course ID. And the second attribute, program coordinator ID, is an attribute that refers to the program coordinator ID. So for the same case, we have entered 10 data for this entity. So moving to the next, program learning outcome, which is PLO. So for the first attribute is usually the primary key, which is the PLO ID. So in the same case as CLO, it has a content. We store it as PLO content as a type of varchar 255, so we can store the content into PLO content. And the third attribute is program coordinator ID, which refer to the program coordinator ID, and the course ID reference to the course entity course ID attribute. So moving into the next entity, which is the course coordinator CRO reference, which is an entity for the course coordinator to reference to the CRO, which is a new entity that we created in the logical ERD. So for the first attribute, it's a course coordinator ID that reference to the course coordinator entity of course coordinator ID attribute. So for the CRO ID, it's an attribute that refers to the CRO, which is a course learning outcome entity, CRO ID attribute. So moving to the next entity, the course coordinator PRO reference. The first entity is same, course coordinator ID, which reference to the course coordinator using the course coordinator ID attribute, and PRO ID reference to the program learning outcome entity, PRO ID attribute. So you can see the data we enter here is beside here. And for the rubric, as you can see, the rubric entity has its own primary key as a rubric ID and have a rubric content as a varchar 255 to show the content, and we have the author, and we have a rubric rating, which is number, which is from range of 2 to 5. 0 to 5. And for the rubric CRO reference, which is the next entity, the first attribute, rubric ID, is a attribute that reference to the rubric entity, rubric ID attribute, and same CRO ID reference to the course learning outcome entity, CRO attribute. And then for the next entity attribute, rubric PRO reference is same as the previous case, previous entity. The only difference is PRO ID that reference to the program learning outcome, PRO ID attribute. Moving to the next entity, lecturer. So you can see from here that lecturer ID is a primary key for this entity, and we can store the lecturer name, lecturer password, and email for this entity. And you can see from here is a data we enter, which is same as the lecturer that for this same. So for the assignment entities, so for the assignment ID is a primary key for this entity. We have an assignment content that store the content of the assignment, and we have a lecturer ID that reference to the lecturer that gives this assignment, which is reference to the lecturer entity lecturer ID attribute. Moving to next, assignment rubric reference. We have our rubric ID, which is same, reference to rubric entity, rubric ID attribute, and assignment ID, reference to the assignment entity, assignment ID attribute. So lecturer rubric reference that same, lecturer ID reference to the lecturer entity, lecturer ID attribute, rubric ID reference to rubric entity, rubric ID attribute, which you can see from here the data we enter for this entity in the DML. So moving to the 17th entity, which is sections. So for this, we have a section ID that acts as primary key for this data for this entity, and the course ID that refers to the course attribute is course ID, and the lecturer ID that refers to a lecturer, and the attribute is lecturer ID. So you can see that the data we enter from here, and is some addition note that we given, which is the section ID does not mean that section number, such as section ID 11 does not mean that section 11 of a course. So moving to next, student entity. We have a first attribute, which is student ID that acts as primary key for this entity, and we have stored a student name, student password, and email, and the section ID that refers to the section entity of the section ID attribute. You can see the data that we enter here, which had a primary key and a foreign key. So moving to the next entity, we have student assignment request, which has a student ID that refers to the previous entity, which is student entity of the student ID attributes, and assignment ID that refers to the assignment entity of the assignment ID attribute. And the 20 entity, which is student rubric reference. The first entity is student ID, that which is reference same to the student entity with the student ID attribute, and rubric ID reference to the rubric entity with the rubric ID attributes. And this is the data we enter for this entity. Moving to the last second entity, which is student assignment. We have a submission ID that store as primary key for this entity, submission content, submission time, store as date, lecturer ID that reference to a lecturer entity, and student ID reference to the student entity. This is the data that we store, and as you can see that the submission content is different and the submission time is in the format of date. Moving to the next entity, which is student result. As you can see, we have stored the attribute result ID as a primary key for this entity, and we have stored the grade score, which is 10, 10, 10 for in the DML. And then we have an assignment ID that reference to the assignment entity, and a student ID that reference to the student, which is that each student that did the assignment and the lecturer will grade it, and the reference that which the student did and for which assignment. So I think that's all for the DML and DDL. Now I will stop sharing my screen and pass to Ricky to share his screen. I will pass to Ricky to share his screen to start his presentation about the query.
Okay, good day everyone. So this is the last part of our presentation, which is the test query. So we start to the first test query, which is display student name in the interface. So this one is a very simple coding, which we select the student name from the table student where the email equal to the student login email. So in this case, the student login email is Wenjun Tai. So here the name display is the name of this email. Okay, you can see at here they got the name of the user. So the next query is display PLO detail at the program page. So this is the interface at the program page, and we can see here got the PO code, which is PO1, PO2, and the description. And we get it from the database using the select PLO ID and select PLO content from the table program learning outcome. So this is the coding and the example of output using SQLite. So we go to the third query, display CRO detail at the course page. So this is the CRO detail display. We have CRO1 and the description, and also CRO2 and CRO3. And we get it using the select CRO ID, select CRO content from cross learning outcome where the course ID is equal to SCCD 2613. Okay. So the next one is display all assignment in student interface. So this one is the student interface. The student is Taiwan Jun. And we can see here, this interface display all the assignment under the session SCCD 2613 session 6. And how we get it? We use select project, which is the project name, and roll number, and assignment content, which is the title of the assignment, from student assignment request table. And we're using the job with the assignment table, and we get the student ID and the assignment. Okay, so next one is the display the course detail. So here we can see that at the course page, we have the course owner ID and course coordinator ID, whether it tell us this course belong to who. So Sam will select the course owner ID and course coordinator ID from the table course, where the course ID is equal to SCCD 2613. So here we can see that the course owner ID is 9192, and the course coordinator ID is 9202. The next one is display assignment score in student interface. So we can see here, this is what students see after the lecturer grade their assignment. So we can see here that the grading status, the student get 10 marks out of 10 marks. So how we get it, we select the grade score from the table student result, where the student ID is equal to the user, and the assignment ID, which assignment. In this case, the assignment ID is 1, and this student get the mark 10. Okay, the seventh function is display all students under the session. So this function is for the lecturer. They want to see under their session we have what student. So we select student name from student where the session ID is equal to 06. So this is an example of the interface, and this is the output of our database. So we can see that it will display all the student name under that session ID. So the next one is display user email and ID. So this one is for the staff. So we can see here the user email is program coordinator what credit duty and domain, and we got the ID. So this is a very simple query. Okay, the next one is the main query or the main function, which is about the Ruby. So in here we display the Ruby ID and also the Ruby rating. How we get it? We select Ruby ID, Ruby rating from the table of Ruby. So this is what we get from the table Ruby. Okay, we didn't display the Ruby content, and here we only display the ID and rating. So the next one is we display the Ruby based on the Ruby rating map. So in this case, we're using the descending order. Okay, we select Ruby ID and Ruby rating from Ruby order by Ruby rating descending order. So here, if you display the Ruby ID with higher rating, which is 5, 4, 3, 3, and the respective Ruby ID. So the next one is display detail of the selected Ruby. So this one is related with the previous function when the lecturer select, let's say R003. So here we display the Ruby content, which is the author of the Ruby, the rating of the Ruby, and the Ruby content, which is complete understand the basic concept in ERD. So we go to the next one, display all the course under the program. So this one is for the program coordinator. In its interface, the system will display all the course under it. Okay, so the query is select course ID from program course, where the program course or the coordinator ID is 9196. So this is all the course organized by this program coordinator. Okay, the next one is display the session under a lecturer. So this one is display all the session for a lecturer. So in this case, the lecturer we display is the ID is 9208. So when we select it, it will display all the session under the lecturer. So in this case, we say that the lecturer is Noali Binti Ibrahim, and she only has 2 sessions for SAD. Okay, the next one is display all the assignment under a session lecturer. This one is in the lecturer interface. So same we select project, which is the initial part, and the roll number P1, P2, something like this. And the assignment content, which is the assignment title here, from the table assignment, where lecturer ID is equal to 9210. So this one is in the lecturer interface. The lecturer can see that he already give the student what assignment. So we move to the next, display the CRO number of the course. So in this case, the system will display the CRO based on the number of CRO in the database. So in this case, the course ID we use is the SCCD 2613. And in this case, there are 4 CRO. So in here, we already display 4 CRO to be chosen. So next one is the display all the detail and the Ruby. So this one is the interface when you create a Ruby for an assignment. So first you need to select the CRO, and then you need to select the Ruby you want to use. So in here we display all the detail of the Ruby, including the Ruby ID, the Ruby content, the Ruby author, and the Ruby rating. So the lecturer can simply click the add button and generate a Ruby marking schema. So the last one is display all the detail of Ruby by ascending of Ruby rating. This one is also the continuous function for the function previous. So in here we arrange the Ruby ID in the ascending order. So here we can see that the Ruby O is 333. The Ruby with rating 5 is at the bottom. So this one, we want to make let the lecturer customize the Ruby making interface. So that's all from us. We hope that this video can help you to understand our project. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.